Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Jack, back in to bring you our official 11.2 Season 3 Mythic Plus tier list for healers. It's going to go over the top healers in the most competitive groups, what I think is going to be the most powerful, and also keeping in mind some of the potential comps we might be seeing with like tanks and DPS, what's going to sort of synergize with all of those things. So if you like these tier lists, be sure to like and subscribe, and check out our description because we have some brand new healer apparel as well. Starting it off, we've got Resto Druid. Now this is an S tier and might even be in an S plus tier. The spec with Wildstalker produces an immense amount of the symbiotic blooms from the hero talent, and the tier set bonus causes your clear casts with your free regrowths to proc additional symbiotic blooms onto your allies. When you pair this with a talent like Root Network, which increases your overall output, you have an amazingly potent combo to blast a freaking crazy amount of output to deal with heavy incoming damage that's not based around your cooldowns. You do, of course, have Convoke for either damage or for healing, and a little bit of both. That is extremely helpful in that 1 minute cooldown. Tranquility has now been buffed for 5-mans like all the other raid cooldowns, and that's a very legit healing CD available to you. But you also just consistently blast crazy amounts of output. If you're maintaining your life bloom, you're going to get a lot of clear casting procs onto your allies. You can pool them up to 2 times. And if you know there's a lot of incoming damage coming just around the corner, you can pool them up, wait for it, dump those regrowth casts, or start spreading symbiotic blooms, which also are a smart heal. So if you're into encounters like in Floodgate, for example, where on Swamp Face the healer almost never takes damage, really, unless there's the stomp, and on the final boss only 2 targets at a time are taking incoming dot damage, the symbiotic blooms will prefer the more injured targets, focus onto them, which makes your spot healing, your single target healing, triage healing incredibly strong. Now there are a lot of burst mechanics in dungeons like Dawnbreaker, Arakara, and many others, Priory included as well. And in those situations as well, you also can sustain really high output. And that's one of the biggest benefits, I think, for Druid at the moment, dealing with the incoming dungeon pool, is there's a mix of burst AoE, and there is a lot of single target damage. There's only one dungeon with poison spells, and that's Arakara. The curses, I think they exist in like Dawnbreaker, and maybe one other, but they're really not that big of a deal. They remove the curses from Halls of Atonement, and now they're just magic dispels. So what Druid really is going to be excelling at is, of course, yeah, bringing Mark of the Wild, bringing great things like Ironbark for good defensives. But when it comes to the incoming healer challenges, they just deal with it better. I think that they just have an enormous amount of raw output that allows you to just muscle heal through a lot of incoming problems. When it comes to compositional concerns, well, I've heard a lot of dooming from Boomkins and everything, of course. And there's also been the need for Mark of the Wild in like higher echelon groups. Now this isn't as relevant really in your 10s and 12s, but I think your capability to muscle heal through a lot of problems when you're in pug groups is incredibly good. Your crowd control is very good with Typhoon, Disorienting Roar, Ursul's Vortex. You have a low interrupt kick. You have a de-enrage. There's not insane enrages, but that's always really helpful as there's really strong amount of tank damage in the incoming patch. So especially when you're pugging, getting a couple enrages, getting a couple soothes out there is still incredibly helpful. So our Druid, I think, is even S plus tier at the moment. If they were going to have some synergy with some of the other up and coming like DPS, I know Shadow's been doing really well lately on PTR. Either way, their capability, and they also do good damage. I didn't really talk about it too much at all because it's not the biggest factor, I think, that comes into play these days, because healer damage is much lower than we've had in prior expansions, but it is good. If you could sit there and start getting into cat form, take advantage of things like Call of the Elder Druid and Dream of Cenarius, where your damage converts into healing about every minute. That's also great for low to medium levels of damage coming out. Then you can shift back into people form and blast tons of healing. So Druid absolutely pipes, and I think it's going to be leading the charge as we get ourselves started with Season 3. Also, don't forget about Disc Priest, though. Not only is Oracle still strong, they did nerf the shields in PTR quite substantially, nerfing both Wheel and Woe and Preventative Measures, which is like a baseline shield increase. They got some pretty heavy hits onto those shields, but they still produce anywhere from like 20 to 50% of your health in a power word shield, which is still really strong, protecting you from a lot of one-shots. And They also do a fantastic job of really like flexibly healing through a lot of incoming damage. You have your Shadow Fiend, and you have, of course, your insight charges, which give you cooldown reduction that you could spend on penance for damage or direct healing, or you could spend it on Power Word Shield, depending on the situation you're in. But the tier set also gives you more insight charges. And with that, you can make your Piety and your Solace even better cooldowns to consistently heal through a lot of incoming pressure. And they've not only buffed things like Tranquility in 5-mans, but they've also buffed Luminous Barrier in 5-mans. Now, at the highest key levels, the best groups, they're going to run regular Barrier because people will stand in it. But for a lot of you guys out there pugging, you already know that people are not standing in that consistently enough. And Luminous Barrier is pretty solid. It's a 3-minute cooldown, which is awful, but it does produce, I think it's similar healing in shield form, of course, to Evangelism. And this gives you just another cooldown you can rely upon, especially when people are spread out all over the place. Just a very safe pick. And I think a lot of people are going to use Luminous Barrier just pressing the button a lot more than regular Barrier, because a lot of people always think about how consistent or how much value they're going to get out of it, and then they end up kind of holding on to it too long. When you hit something with an Absorb, you can see the value right in front of you. Now, let's not forget, Voidweaver also exists, and it not only exists like it did in Season 2, but I think it's actually thriving in Season 3. Their tier set bonus, to put it simply, just does Voidweaver things better. You are able to cast your Void Blasts more rapidly, and you even get into like GCD cap situations when Bloodlust is up, which also is going to be expanding your Rift, which does an enormous amount of damage. The spec not only is doing very high passive DPS, but it handles a lot of incoming burst damage in dungeons like Arakara and Dawnbreaker extremely well. This is the spec, in Season 1 of the War Within that was just reversing all this even bursty damage onto everybody constantly. And since that point, they have made the direct healing out of Penance better, so even though it's not a strength of Voidweaver to do single target healing, you can do enough to get through a lot of hurdles, especially when you're mixing in, pain subs onto priority allies to help them out as well. So don't sleep on Voidweaver. I think there's a good argument to be made for some of the lower damage dungeons we've seen, which are kind of like Tazvesh, which doesn't seem to have that many brutal healing requirements and not many areas of high single target healing. Probably the Pirate Captain is the first one that comes to mind in Tazvesh that's particularly nasty, but most of the dungeon, both the lower and upper versions, are pretty straightforward in terms of burst AoE being the main thing that needs to be reversed. A lot of trash density, which means your Rift is going to do a ton of damage. Arakara and Dawnbreaker are predominantly, there's a little bit of single target, but they're predominantly burst AoE dungeons as well, which fits in very well with Voidweaver. So in my opinion, I think that the optimal decision is to play a bit of both, with Oracle being the safer option. And if you wanted to do that, you basically would use your rings and neck pieces and kind of shift them around between or Crit Mastery for Oracle and like Haste Verse when it comes to Voidweaver. But both, I think, are in a very strong position, and I think there's a very good argument to be made for Disc still being in that S tier in Season 3. Our final S tier healer is Resto Shaman, and it's been enormously fun. Your incoming tier set bonus is going to be proccing an additional ancestor when you cast your Ancestral Swiftness, which replaces Nature Swiftness. So on a 30-second cooldown, you will summon not only your regular grandma, but then your tier set bonus spawns a grandpa that does about 5% more healing and damage, something along those lines. Not only that, but you get an 8-second window where you do additional healing and damage and get your Lava Burst and your Riptide back more rapidly. What this allows you to do with a Farseer setup is it allows you to have an additional burst window outside of most of your big cooldowns. So you don't have to be as dependent on Ascendance just to do good healing. If you have Unleash on a 15-second cooldown, that spawns an Ancestor, and these Ancestors are replicating your spells if you're not familiar with Farseer. Then you have a 30-second cooldown on Ancestral Swiftness, which procs 2 of them. You merge those things together, you pop your Cloudburst Totem, which stores healing from your spells. I don't believe it does it from your ancestors yet, though we've been asking. And then that allows you to have an incredibly powerful 8-second burst window, which juices up your Cloudburst Totem. And then when your ancestors fade, they also put out absorbs onto you and your allies, which decays pretty rapidly as well. This allows you to kind of shift from your ancestors doing healing to your Cloudburst doing healing, to some additional absorbs to kind of keep everybody healthy. And with this, you have a very long period of time where you're building up ancestors that do a crazy amount of additional output, both for single target and for AoE. Your mana efficiency is also very, very strong when you're playing as Farseer, because you don't have to worry about casting things like Surging Totem at all. And I'm really only casting Healing Rain for like acid rain value when I don't have any ancestors. I don't even feel like I have to actually cast Healing Rain at all when I play as Farseer. But you really do have to make sure you're putting out lots of Riptides onto your allies to benefit from Deluge, which does increased healing onto your allies with those buffs from Riptide, and of course Ancestral Vigor, increasing their stamina. So Farseer is in an incredibly strong position both for healing, damage, mana efficiency. And Totemic isn't bad either. Totemic is, the straightforward, easy mode version, and I think it's a little weaker than Farseer in like super sweaty keys. But if you just enjoy playing Shaman, want an easy time just to hang out with the bros and stuff and do well, Totemic's good too. There's a lot of emphasis on Downpour triggering additional buffs for either your Surge or your Chain Heal with the incoming tier set bonus. This is still pretty good, but unfortunately it also puts a lot of output into a stacked environment, and so you will prefer environments where people are stacked. Really important thing is on dungeons like Dawnbreaker. Last I tested them on PTR, you were not actually triggering the downpours that you needed to, and the worst one was actually that you were not consuming the whirling motes from your Surging Totem. So there's a couple issues with it in that dungeon whenever you're on the boats. I hope that they get these fixed very, very soon, but Totemic isn't any sort of slouch. Additionally, the Mastery buff out of Sky Fury is incredibly helpful. There's going to be some comps with Shaman DPS, and I think those without. Ellie Shaman at the time of this video was getting buffs and also not getting nerfed like other casters were, so that's always something to watch out for. If they can get the balance right, I think this could be really good for Restoration Shaman, and they also bring an absurd amount of crowd control. And all these dungeons have lots and lots of kicks. I also mentioned in the other specs so far, raid healing cooldowns got buffed, so you have things like Healing Tide Totem, which does very good output, and with the Spirit Walker's Title Totem, you get instant cast surges that also cost less, allowing Healing Tide to actually be a really legit cooldown to help you out along the way. Not only that, you got Slink, you got Ascendance, and if you're playing with Farseer, when you get better at using your Cloudburst Totem, it does immense amounts of healing and really helps you always have something no matter what the situation is throwing at you. Farseer does absurd amounts of damage as well. If you just hit your Unleash, hit your Ancestral Swiftness, and mash Chain Lightnings, you're going to just start doing insane amounts of DPS, especially as a healer, so that's awesome too. Next up, we have our A tier, which are healers that I think can do pretty well, but in a bit more niche of scenarios. First off, we've got Holy Paladin. Now, they've been getting a decent amount of buffs throughout the PTR cycle to a lot of their spenders, and it's really helped push Herald of the Sun even more to the forefront than I think that it already was. Lightsmith was basically killed off at the end of Season 1, going into Season 2. Haven't really seen it since. I have tried it a number of times throughout the PTR process, but Herald of the Sun's just been dominant. The latest buffs at the time of this video took some power out of Sun's avatar and put it into your direct healing and to your spenders, which is a really good buff when it comes to a 5-man environment, because often Sun's avatar isn't as large of an amount of your output in 5-mans as it can be in a raid environment, especially, when people are stacked in a raid for you. So, Paladin, building up their holy power with their shocks, Crusader Strike, Judgment, being able to spend it on their Eternal Flame, predominantly in a 5-man environment. Lately, they've been running double beacon, which is always really helpful for both tank healing and for prio target healing on somebody who's a little bit further away, who isn't as close, because your mastery increases your healing based on your proximity to your allies or where they're standing next to you, or to your beacon location. So dropping the beacons onto your allies at range is also very helpful. They've been getting a steady amount of these buffs, like I've been mentioning, throughout the PTR cycle. And while they deal, pretty mediocre amounts of damage, their healing is what I would call a good situation, but not a great situation. There's a lot of times throughout the War Within that Paladin's been in this pretty good situation when it comes to healing, and it has not been one of the highest raw output healers. They try to make up for this with some of the mitigation tools out of things like Devotion Aura, Bubble, Sack, even some damage reduction that's tied to Blessing of Protection as well. You got your Lay on Hands, you can play into cooldown reduction for it as well. You have a couple different options to sort of get around it, but in reality, at the end of the day, they are not the highest HPS, and there's some really brutal heal checks going out into the next season. And so you can play around it very well in high echelon groups when you're manipulating people's defensives and using your own immunities and defensives to give to allies. That stuff is great. Unfortunately, things like Devo Aura didn't get a raid buff the way that all the other healer cooldowns did. So anything from Divine Hymn to Luminous Barrier to Tranquility, all these things got buffs in 5-bans. But Devotion Aura did not as a damage reduction tool because it doesn't do healing. So yes, Devo is extremely strong and it gets better as you get into higher keys for just raw damage reduction reasons, but it still hurts the position, in my opinion, that they don't have an additional output increase specifically for 5-bans the way that a lot of these other healers do. Spec is in like a pretty good spot to play, I think, but there's also a lot of what I would call sort of like invisible healing, where you have some output tied to things like Greater Judgment. You have some things through like Judgment of Light, some of the hots from Herald of the Sun with like the Dawn Lights, which feel kind of weak and not as impactful. Things like Sun's Avatar, which have some decent healing going into it, but they're not as impactful as just pushing up a health bar with a really good Eternal Flame cast. So they've been taking power out of these more passive healing spells, putting them into your spenders, but I think it's not as significant as I would like it to be to make the spec in an even stronger position when it comes to M+, because historically, they've really excelled at doing lots of good spot healing, lots of good triage healing, and we're slowly trending in that direction. But I think overall output are concerns, and the sort of sustained output for when you have like really difficult pulls like the Paladins in Priory, where you have to have a long duration out of your wings, like having wings and proccing Awakening, and then just a round of like mitigation DRs running to heal through the sustained burst after burst after burst of those incoming damage. I think a lot of the other healers on the higher tiers deal with those situations more easily, and that's why I think Paladin is at this A tier, where it's in a good position, but not a great or insane elite position right now. On the same tier is Mistweaver Monk. Now, they've been incredibly strong throughout Raid in this expansion, but M+, they've consistently been lagging behind as they try to find the right, I guess, development for the spec. They've had it with Jade Empowerment this expansion, where their Crackling Jade Lightning can do a ton of healing and a ton of output. They've had to change it from doing a lot of direct damage to a primary target to doing just mostly cleave damage. In Season 3, that ability feels kind of mediocre. Sheilun's Gift, especially in Dragonflight, felt like this huge lay on hands for your group. This feels kind of mediocre, and you're playing a lot of like Xiaohao's lessons to play off the stat buffs now, instead of maximizing the like direct healing that you can get out of the spell, since it's on a bit more of the weaker angle. They have taken some power out of Chi Harmony, which is when you cast your Renewing Mist on your ally, it marks them and makes them take increased healing. It was 50% in Season 2. It's now going to be 25% going into Season 3. And to compensate, they've taken some power from Chi Harmony, putting it into your direct healing out of things like Vivify, which does feel really good whenever you're going into dungeons and need to drop some emergency prio healing onto them. And they've also made it easier to manipulate and play a little bit quicker with things like Vivacious Vivication, where your Rising Sun Kick resets the instant cast cooldown that Vivify has. So you can play around hitting a Rising Sun Kick, dropping an instant cast Vivify. Whether you're moving around or just planning some direct healing, it's an incredibly helpful way to play. And a lot of the tier sets, especially Master of Harmony, has been really helpful for a dungeon environment, but it seems a bit more focused on like low to mid damage periods. What you basically get is a charge of Harmonic Surge, which causes your Tiger Palm to deal more damage and heal. That's really, really helpful in these low to mid damage periods, but then it becomes kind of like a supplement when you have to use, Chi G for really high damage periods. Revival, of course, got the other round of raid buffs, so that's actually a legit cooldown as well. That being said, your tier set bonus kind of helps your low to mid healing, and Chi Harmony is still very strong for the prio healing situations that you have, but you don't have what I would call like lots and lots of really big tools to deal with super high sustained damage the way some of the other healers in the S tier, I think, can deal with them. I'm talking about like really high level swamp faces, really high level like Priory Paladin pulls. Mistweaver's in a good position and they have some tools to deal with it, but I don't think they deal with it as easily as the higher echelon healers. Now that said, Windwalker recently got some nerfs, which could further elevate Mistweaver into the Fizz comps, which they really started making a name for themselves in Season 2. that could be an easy way to do it. And I would not be surprised at all to see Mistweaver really highly represented in those Fizz comps if Brewmaster doesn't pan out. If Brewmaster does pan out, I'd be a little bit more worried about the state of Mistweaver. And I think that since they're in this sort of good level of healing, but not elite level of overall output, that's going to hurt their position, I think, quite a bit in the incoming meta. Kind of similar to how it was in Season 2, where you really just saw them in Fizz comps and not really much else. It is kind of concerning that the spec kind of gets like pigeonholed into we'll bring you for this comp just because you bring the Fizz buff kind of setup. I'm a little concerned about what that means for the long-term ramifications of Monk, where you're like praying that other melee specs are good so that you can be in these groups. We'll have to see. But I think, like I said, Mistweaver's in a good spot, but not an elite one right now. All right, now we get into the B tier. So I always want to make sure you guys know why I have things labeled the way they are. B tier are healers that can bring some good tools, but I think they're held back for very specific reasons, whether it is survivability, like in the case of Holy Priest, or as we'll talk about in just a second, some of the setup and the work required to produce good output as Preservation Evoker. Raid buffs also, of course, play a role in this as well. Holy Priest. Now, they felt pretty good in Season 2. I myself got to do multiple 19s and 18s as Holy Priest, getting to almost 3,700 in Season 2 with Holy Priest. So this isn't a bad healer or anything along those lines. Tier lists are always going to have, a top and a bottom rung, and Holy Priest, I think, gets slightly better going into Season 3 as a result, especially of their Oracle tier set bonus, which causes their Prayer of Mendings to put out direct healing onto your allies every single time that you cast them. It's about the strength of like half a Serenity, so it's a pretty juicy heal that you can put out onto your allies that helps a lot with the prio target situation. It makes Prayer of Mending just a better spell to cast since it doesn't do a lot of direct healing on its own. It's these small buffs you place on allies that trigger a small heal whenever they take damage. Now it's a lot easier to justify casting it a lot and set up for that incoming healing. The encounters where you're going to need the highest output, like Swamp Face and like the Gigazap boss and the final boss of Floodgate, get substantially easier when you have all of these Prayer of Mendings flowing around, doing a lot of healing. You excel in those environments, in fact, and can do extremely, extremely well. Now, on the other hand, some of the problems with Holy Priest come with dealing with incoming burst damage, and especially extremely high levels of burst damage. I'm talking like a Nubicage or like Priory Paladin pulls where you need to sustain like burst after burst after burst to like blast tons of healing onto allies every second. Like you have to do it like elite level of keys. That's where I think Holy Priest is going to struggle more. You can do a decent job when it comes to using your Prayer of Healing, which is actually a good ability now, and utilizing that with Lightweaver for additional buffs and Resonant Words for additional buffs to make your Prayer of Healing absolutely blast. That being said, it's not in this elite level of blasting. It can be when you have certain abilities like Premonition of Piety up, which redirects overhealing and increases your healing. That works extremely, extremely well, but you're also playing around that cooldown. So it's like Apotheosis, which resets your Holy Words, lets you cast them more rapidly, and Piety, which increases your healing, redirects overhealing. You have some really good tools to deal with it, but at the same time, you don't have as high of sustain, I think, as some of the other healers, and your survivability is extra bad. I haven't talked too much about Archon, but it's also pretty cooldown dependent, where you have like Halo and Apotheosis together, you can deal with anything. When you don't have those cooldowns together, you're really gonna struggle, and that's, I think, where a lot of the spec is at the moment. Dealing with sustained single target damage, pretty good. Dealing with rot damage, very good. Dealing with lots of burst damage, Nubicage, Priory Paladin pulls, is about mediocre. You can push very high keys. Once again, like I said, I've done 18s and 19s in Season 2, but I think the spec is just kind of lacking in the survivability department and the ability to just funnel enough of their output into high burst situations and deal with it as masterfully as I think some of the other healers have. It doesn't help as well that they don't quite have some of the damage reduction tools or super high output out of things like, Spirit Link Totem, ridiculous high output that our Druid has, the shielding that Disc brings to the table, or the raw burst that Voidweaver brings to the table. There's a few different things that make those specs elite, and I think Holy Priest survivability and the ability to reverse high burst damage are probably the biggest weak spots that put it at a B tier. Last up on our list, we've got Preservation Evoker. Now, some of the big benefits going into next season is that Chrono Warden Preservation is one of the highest DPS healers. But unfortunately, this kind of goes hand in hand with a season where the amount of overall damage a healer brings is incredibly low relative to the damage dealers. So it's not a huge factor if you're a big damage dealing healer. Chrono Warden got some nice buffs with its tier set bonus, causing your tip the scales cooldown to now be 1 minute instead of 2 minutes, and the temporal burst window that follows, which gives you cooldown reduction, haste, all that good stuff, causes your living flame or chrono flames now to cleave to 2 additional targets. So if you're casting Living Flame on an enemy, it'll try to cleave onto 2 enemies first. If no other targets are available, then it'll turn into healing. Same thing goes for Living Flame. It'll try to cleave onto 2 additional allies if you cast it initially on an ally as well. This means that you could do a crazy amount of damage out of your Chrono Flames if you're prepping for it, which is always really cool. But what really puts Preservation into the B tier are things like having a really poor raid buff for the group, having, I would say, decent healing, even in some cases having elite levels of healing for big burst, but not having that same strength when it comes to more sustained damage, and certainly not elite levels of healing when it comes to prio target healing. Now, you might be able to do pretty well in an environment like Swamp Face, which has some rot damage elements, and you can easily echo a bunch of reversions onto your allies to help with some of the rot damage, and then every 30 seconds, pair up some of your combos for dealing with like the Awaken the Swamp, like damage that's pulsing out onto the group. You can deal with those pretty well, but when you go into something like the Gigazap final boss, you need to do some incredibly high 2 target cleave healing, which is possible but not a huge strength for them. Having some tools like double time dilation, which was added in season 3, does help quite a bit, but relative to their peers, they have to set up a lot longer and more accurately than I think a lot of other healers do. The downsides, if you need to drop a lot of single target into an ally while you're setting up your echoes, can also be incredibly high, since your single target heals will consume echoes on everybody else. So you have to like cut your plans short just to be able to keep other people alive in the process and keep that like 1 extra person alive. So their ability to deal with unexpected damage is in a pretty poor position. Their healing can be extremely bursty, but it'd be like high highs and like low lows, where you're waiting for your next empower abilities, especially Spirit Bloom, to come off cooldown. I think they're still in need of some additional reworks to deal with some of this quality of life for just setting up your healing. And I think how they've taken some of the talents and encouraged you to drop some talents, like I dropped on PTR Call of Ysera since I wasn't getting a ton of value out of it, which requires a lot more setup because you have to Verdant Embrace before you Dream Breath. I dropped that and I got the double time dilation, and that felt great. And that's one thing I'd like to see taken to another level with Preservation, is dampen down some of the things like Grace Period, for example, that are going to require a lot more setup. Even things like, I think it's like Temporal Compression to get faster empowers, that also just feels really tedious. Having to like wait longer for these healing abilities when like, you know, spec like Resto Shaman gets their High Tide proc, they just cast a chain heal and everyone's good. It feels very imbalanced in how you set up your healing, playing Preservation compared to playing a lot of the other healers. You could do so much output with like all these echoes, especially if you're manually casting them, that it feels like they make a lot of your spells your baseline on the weaker side because you're expected to do all this setup in advance for it. And that's where I think the spec is going to struggle a lot more, both with new players and in like elite level groups. I would not be surprised in season 2, 20s were completed with Preservation Evoker, so it's not like they're going to be in the garbage. But I think relative to their peers, they're just not as strong. They're not in as strong of a position relative to their peers. So I hope that Midnight starts bringing around a little bit of like a rework for them. A few other healers I think are also in that boat as well. But that's my tier list for season 3. Let me know what you guys think as we get ourselves started with the season. Keep an eye out for our spec guides and class guides, as they are going to be right around the corner as well. And if you're enjoying the tier list, be sure to like and subscribe. New apparel in the store. Check it out in the description as well. Love your faces. Thank you so much for all the patrons, and I'll catch you all next time.